Last episode, 6 of 6, and I'm starting a little differently today. Not with a museum, not with an object, but with a really simple question. What do you know about art history? I mean, really, what comes to mind when you hear the words Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, the Impressionists, Picasso? Your list is probably European. That's not an accident. That's Eurocentrism. Welcome to the final episode of Room for Colors. I'm Tina, art historian and creativity educator, and this is art history with plenty of color and zero dust. Today we wrap up our special series on colonialism and art with maybe the most fundamental question of all. What is Eurocentrism? Eurocentrism means treating Europe as the measure, as the starting point, as the center from which everything else gets judged. That sounds abstract at first, but look at how art history gets told. There's a canon, a kind of list of works, artists, eras that count as important. And that canon is overwhelmingly European, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white. That doesn't mean this art is bad. It means the list isn't completed, and it was made by someone with particular interests. The quiet hierarchy. Over the course of colonial history, an hierarchy emerged. European art equals high culture, complex, meaningful, canonial. Non-European art, ethnographic material, interesting but not equal. This distinction was never said out loud. It was just there, in museum labels, in curricula, in what counts as art and what as craft. And it still echoes today. An example, the masks and the sculptures. When a European sculpture carves a human figure, we call it sculpture. When an artist from West Africa makes the same form, with centuries of tradition behind it, we often call it a mask or a ritual object. That's not a linguistic trifle. That's a categorization. And categorizations say something about how we assign value. Which story gets told, whose work gets explained, and whose only gets shown. Who wrote the histories? Art history is a discipline with a history of its own. It took shape mainly in the 18th and 19th century in Europe by European men. That shapes what got researched, what got documented, what counted as important. Art histories from other parts of the world often weren't written down at all. At least not in a form that was visible within the Western academic system. That doesn't mean that those histories didn't exist. It means they fell out of the culture, out of the official picture. So what happens when one story becomes the story? The strange thing about Eurocentrism is that most of us don't notice it. I certainly didn't. When I first started studying art history, I thought I was studying art history, not European art history, just art history. And for a long time, those two things seemed almost identical. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Impressionism, modernism, and of course these are important. They absolutely deserve attention. But at some point I started wondering, what was everyone else doing? Because while Michelangelo was painting the Sixtine Chapel, millions of people elsewhere were creating things too. Entire artistic traditions existed in China, Japan, Korea, India, West Africa, the Americas, Oceania. Most of them were older than many European traditions. Just my favorite example is porcelain. Some were just as sophisticated. Some developed completely different ideas about what art should even be. And yet many of us can name 10 European artists before we can name one artist from another part of the world. That isn't a coincidence. That's a result of which stories were preserved, taught, funded, and exhibited. It's the museum effect. Let's imagine two museums. In the first museum, you walk into a large room, painting hang on the wall, Every artist's name is displayed. You learn about their childhood, their influence, their techniques, their struggles. The artist becomes an individual genius, a person, a creator. Now imagine a second museum room. In a glass case sits an object from somewhere else in the world. The label says, unknown artist. Wood, West Africa. 19th century. That's it. No life story, no artistic development, no discussion of style, no analysis of innovation. The object is there, but the maker has disappeared. One artist becomes the genius, the other becomes anonymous. And that difference matters, because the way we display things shape how we value them. So, art or artifact? One of the most powerful questions we can ask is, why do we call some things art and others artifacts? Think about that word, artifact. It's often used for objects from cultures outside Europe, masked textiles, ceremonial objects, carvings, jewelry. But imagine calling a Renaissance altarpiece an artifact, or calling a Rodin sculpture an artifact. It sounds strange, because we've been trained to see one category as art and the other as something else. Yet both were made by skilled human beings. Both required knowledge. Both carried meaning. Both reflected culture. The distinction isn't always about the object itself. Sometimes it's about who made it. And then there's the problem with discovery. Eurocentrism also appears in language. Take the word discovered. European explorers are often described as discovering places. But those places were already inhabited. People were living there, traded there, creating art there, raising families there, telling stories there. Nobody discovers a place where millions of people already live. What actually happened was that Europeans encountered places that were new to them. That sounds like a small difference, but language shapes how we think, and history is often hidden inside words. The invisible standard. One thing I noticed is that Europe often becomes the invisible standard. We compare everything to it. African art, Asian art, indigenous art, Islamic art, but we rarely say European art. We just say art. Europe becomes the default. Everywhere else becomes the category. And that's one of the clear signs of Eurocentrism. Not hatred, not malice, just a habit. A habit so old that many people don't even see it anymore. But why does this matter to artists today? You might be listening and thinking, that's interesting, but I'm not a museum's curator, I'm not an academic. Why does this matter to me? Because creativity is shaped by what we think is possible. If we are only shown one tradition, our imagination becomes smaller. The more artistic traditions we encounter, the bigger our creative world becomes. We discover different ways of using color, different ways of telling stories, different ideas about beauty, different ideas about what art is for. Art becomes larger, not smaller, and nobody loses anything in that process. Learning about Japanese printmaking doesn't erase Van Gogh. Learning about Benin bronzes doesn't erase Rembrandt. Learning about Indian miniature paintings doesn't erase Monet. The story simply becomes bigger. And honestly, I think bigger stories are usually better stories. But it's changing, slowly. In recent decades, quite a bit has shifted. More research into non-European art, more exhibitions that address histories of origin, more voices from the source societies in the debate. That's not a complete solution, but it's a start. And museums are beginning, not everywhere, not fast enough, but they are beginning to rethink their labels and to provenance research, to discuss returns. That's not a given. And it doesn't happen without pressure from outside. So what can we do? You don't have to be museums expert to look differently. A few questions that help. Whose gaze does this exhibition tell from? Is the object shown in its context or just as a form? Who wrote the label? How did the object get here? These aren't questions that change everything at once, but they open something up. a different view, a different story. So what this series was and what it wasn't, these 6 episodes weren't a verdict. No wagging fingers, no simply split into good and evil. They were an attempt to ask questions, to make connections visible, to briefly interrupt the things we take as normal, because that's the beautiful thing about art. It's never finished. It can always be read new, again and again, with different eyes. And here comes a small conclusion and a thought to close on. We looked at what colonialism has to do with art, how cultures are in motion, and what that means, what Paisley patterns tell us about global trade, what cultural appropriation is, and when it hurts, how objects like divine bronzes become political questions, and now, how a Eurocentric gaze takes shape, and how we can question it. These aren't closed topics. They keep developing, and you can be part of that, not as an expert, not as an activist, just as someone who stays curious, because curiosity is the beginning of everything. Thank you for being part of this special series. I'm Tina, and this was Room for Colors.